Give her the cellar. It's all she's worth." The words came from her Uncle Dale, said low enough that he probably thought she couldn't hear him. But grief has a way of sharpening a person's ears, and Wren Calloway heard every syllable of it. She was 19 years old, sitting in a folding chair at the back of a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, and she had exactly $41 to her name. She did not turn around. She did not let her face move. She had gotten very good, over the years, at not letting her face move. The lawyer, a tired man named Mr. Prather, with reading glasses perched too far down his nose, cleared his throat and read the line from the will out loud, like it was nothing. "To my granddaughter's daughter, Wren, I leave the root cellar and the quarter-acre surrounding it, situated behind the old tobacco barn on Route 9. A pause. Someone in the front row, an aunt maybe, Wren couldn't tell which one anymore. They all blurred together in dark good coats, let out a short laugh, quickly swallowed. The room did not correct itself. Nobody looked back at her. She had 2 bags. One held her clothes. The other held everything else she owned in the world, which was not much. A photograph of her mother, a folding knife, a phone with a cracked screen, and $41 folded into a coin purse that used to belong to somebody who loved her. What none of them knew, what none of them had bothered to find out, in their rush to divide up the house and the good land and the 7 acres of bottomland that actually grew something, was that the old man who'd written that will had once told her, when she was maybe 7 years old and visiting for what would turn out to be the only summer she ever spent with him, that the cellar held more than any of them will ever understand. She hadn't thought about that sentence in over a decade. She thought about it now, sitting in that folding chair, and something in her chest went very still and very quiet, the way water goes still right before it's about to move. Do you know that feeling, when everyone around you has decided exactly what you're worth, and some small, stubborn part of you refuses to believe them? Nobody in that room offered her a ride home. Nobody offered her a place to stay. Dale actually held the door for her on the way out, which somehow felt worse than if he'd slammed it in her face. She stood on the courthouse steps in a thin jacket, while an early October wind came down off the ridge and cut straight through her, carrying the smell of wet leaves and diesel exhaust from the trucks idling at the gas station across the street. And she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from having nothing left to lose, that she was now the owner of a flooded hole in the ground that her whole family had just used as a punchline. If you're just settling in for this one, maybe with a cup of something warm, maybe getting ready to drift off, I'm glad you're here. This is the kind of story I like telling best. Somebody the world had already written off, finding out the world was wrong. Because what none of them understood, what none of them had cared enough to ask, was that her great-grandfather had never once, in 83 years of life, done anything without a reason. She got a ride, eventually, from a woman named Carol Jean, who ran the diner where Wren had been picking up shifts since she turned 18. Carol Jean didn't ask what happened at the will reading. She just said, "Get in, hun, it's cold," and drove her the 11 miles out to Route 9 without much conversation, the radio playing low, gospel static fading in and out through the hills. The barn came into view before the cellar did, a collapsed grey skeleton of a building, tobacco-drying slats hanging loose like broken ribs, swallowed almost to the roofline by kudzu that had gone brown and brittle with the first frost. Behind it, half hidden in a fold of the hillside, was a low mound of earth with a wooden door set into it at an angle, the wood gone soft and black with rot along the bottom edge. Water had pooled in the depression around the door, dark and still, reflecting a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. She stood there a long moment, $41 in her pocket, and nowhere else in the world she was expected to be. She almost turned around and asked Carol Jean to just take her back to town, back to whatever couch she could find for the night. But there was nowhere else to go, And something about the particular silence of that hillside, no cars, no voices, just wind moving through dead kudzu vines, made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that nobody was watching her fail. So she didn't turn around. She walked toward the door instead. She would spend the next several months learning exactly how much that door was hiding. But to understand how she ended up standing in front of it with $41 and 2 bags, we have to go back 3 years, to the year everything in her life came apart at once. Ren had been 16 when her mother died. Quick, quiet, a heart condition nobody had caught in time, the kind of death that leaves no room for a proper goodbye. There had been no father to speak of. He'd left before Ren could form a memory of him, and her mother had never once brought him up, except to say, "Some people just aren't built to stay." After the funeral, there had been a scramble among the extended family. Aunts and uncles who had not spoken to her mother in years, suddenly very concerned about what happens to the girl. And then, within a few months, a quiet agreement that nobody had room. She went into the foster system at 16, aged out of it at 18 with a garbage bag of belongings and a caseworker's business card, and had been working double shifts at Carol Jean's diner ever since, sleeping on a rotation of couches that never lasted more than a few months before she wore out her welcome, or the welcome wore out her patience. She had met her great-grandfather, Elias Calloway, exactly 3 times in her life. Once as a baby, which she obviously didn't remember. Once at 7, the summer he told her about the cellar. And once more at 14, at a stiff, awkward Thanksgiving where the whole family had gathered because someone thought it might be Elias's last one. It wasn't. He'd lived another 5 years. And Ren remembered him mostly as a quiet, watchful old man who ate very little and said even less, except once when he caught her alone in the kitchen and told her, apropos of nothing, "You've got your great-grandmother's eyes. Don't let anybody talk you into thinking that's not worth something." She hadn't understood what he meant then. She wasn't sure she understood it now, standing in front of his cellar door with cold water soaking through her sneakers. The door was swollen shut, warped by years of rain pooling against it, and when she finally got it open, throwing her whole weight against the wood, palms raw from gripping the rusted handle, the smell that came out was thick and mineral, wet stone and standing water and something underneath it that was almost sweet, like old paper going soft. The flashlight on her phone barely cut through the dark. Water stood ankle-deep across the floor, black and cold, and shelves lined the walls, most of them collapsed, jars shattered, decades of nothing. But in the back corner, half submerged, she saw the edge of something that didn't belong, a shape too square, too deliberate, to be a fallen shelf or a piece of the structure itself. She didn't move toward it yet. The water was cold enough to make her teeth ache just standing in the doorway, and some old, careful part of her, the part that had learned, over and over, not to hope for things, told her to wait until morning, until she had boots, until she had light. She stepped back out into the grey afternoon, pulled the door as shut as its warped frame would allow, and stood there a moment longer, looking at the barn's broken ribs against the sky. Whatever Dale thought this place was worth, he was about to be wrong. She didn't sleep so much as pass through the night in pieces, curled on the back seat of Carol Jean's car. Carol Jean had insisted, said she wasn't about to let her sleep out at that property with no heat and no lock on the door, and Ren had been too tired to argue. By 6 in the morning she was awake anyway, staring at the ceiling of the car, running the shape of that submerged corner over and over in her mind until it stopped looking like anything at all. Carol Jean dropped her at the hardware store on Main Street a little before 8, pressed a 20 into her hand before she could refuse it, and told her to get boots that actually fit and a decent flashlight, and to come back to the diner after for something hot to eat. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Or found one." The hardware store belonged to a man named Gideon Marsh, a broad, slow-moving man in his 60s, with forearms like fence posts and a habit of sizing people up before he said much of anything. He watched Wren come in with her wet sneakers and her $41 minus Carol Jean's 20, watched her go straight for the cheapest rubber boots on the rack, and didn't say a word until she set them on the counter, along with a flashlight and a pry bar she really couldn't afford. "You're Elias Calloway's girl," he said. "Not a question. Great-granddaughter," she said, because the correction mattered to her, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, more like recognition settling into place. "I did some work for him, years back. Fixed his roof twice. Man never said 10 words to me the whole time, but he paid on the day the job was done. Every time. That's more than I can say for half this town." He rang up her purchases, then, without asking, tossed in a pair of thick work gloves and didn't charge her for them. "Cellar's not safe to be poking around in alone," he said. "That structure's been sitting under water pressure for years. You go back out there, you don't go in past your knees till somebody's looked at those support beams. Somebody like who? Like me, if you're willing to have me." He said it plainly. No performance to it. Like he was offering to carry in groceries. "I'm not doing much this week." She wanted to ask why. Nobody in her life had ever offered anything without eventually wanting something back, and she stood there a second too long, waiting for the catch. Gideon just picked up a broom and started sweeping a spot on the floor that didn't need sweeping, giving her room to decide, without watching her decide it. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you. Do you know people like that? The ones who help before you even find the nerve to ask." The walk from the diner back out to Route 9 took the better part of an hour, and word had apparently traveled faster than she had, because by the time she reached the turnoff, a woman was standing at the mailbox at the end of the neighboring drive, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that made it clear exactly what she thought of the whole situation. "You're really gonna live out there?" the woman called. Wren later learned her name was Patsy Rule, and that she'd been married into the extended edges of the Calloway family for 30 years without ever quite being accepted into it, which maybe explained the particular relish in her voice. "Whole family got the good land and the house, and you got a hole full of frogs. Dale said you cried at the reading." "I didn't cry," Wren said, which was true, though it cost her something to say it evenly. "Well," Patsy sniffed, unconvinced. "Don't come asking to borrow my generator when the pipes freeze out there. That cellar's been condemned in everything but paperwork since before I moved here." Wren didn't answer that. She kept walking, the new boots stiff and unbroken against her heels, the pry bar heavy and strange in her bag, and told herself Patsy's opinion weighed exactly nothing. It mostly worked. Gideon's truck was already parked at the barn when she arrived, and he'd brought a second flashlight, a car battery jump pack wired to a work light, and a coil of rope that he set down without explanation. Together, in the grey morning light, they cleared enough kudzu from the cellar door to get proper light down into the space, and Gideon spent a long, careful 20 minutes testing the beams overhead with the flat of his hand and the head of a hammer, listening to the sound the wood made, before he finally said it was solid enough to bail the standing water without it coming down on them. It took most of the day. They ran a hand pump borrowed from Gideon's truck bed, hauling murky water out bucket by bucket, while the barn's broken slats clattered faintly overhead in the wind, and Wren's arms ached in a way that felt, strangely, better than the ache of doing nothing. Somewhere in the middle of the work, Gideon mentioned, almost offhand, that his own father used to talk about the Calloway place, back before the bank thing, and when Wren asked what bank thing, he just shrugged and said his father never told the story the same way twice, something about the whole county losing its savings overnight back in the 30s, and the Calloways being one of the only families that didn't seem to suffer for it the way everyone else did. He didn't seem to think much of the detail. Wren couldn't stop turning it over. By late afternoon, with the water down to a shallow skin across the floor, the square shape in the back corner finally came clear enough to touch. An iron-bound wooden crate, roughly 2 feet across, its lid swollen tight and crusted with rust along the hinges, sitting on a raised stone shelf that had kept it just high enough above the worst of the flooding to survive intact. Beside it, half buried in silt, was a second, smaller shape, something flat and rectangular, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age. Gideon crouched beside her, running his thumb along the crate's rusted latch. "This ain't coming open today," he said. "Not without the right tools, and not without your say-so on how careful we want to be about it. Some of these old locks, you force 'em wrong, you can ruin what's inside, same as leaving it in the water another 10 years. "Tomorrow then," Wren said, and found she meant it as a promise rather than a guess. They covered the crate and the oilcloth bundle with a tarp Gideon had in his truck, more out of habit than necessity, and as they packed up for the day, he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his sister-in-law's cousin had married into a family a county over who apparently still talked about the Callaway letter at church suppers, though he couldn't say what that meant and had never much cared to ask. Wren cared. She stood in the barn's broken doorway as the light went gold and then grey behind the ridge, looking back at the tarp-covered shapes in the cellar, and understood that whatever her great-grandfather had left down there, it wasn't the only thing he'd left unfinished. Wren didn't go back to whatever couch she could scrounge that night. Gideon, without much fuss, mentioned that his wife Ruth Ann kept a spare room made up for nobody in particular, and that it was sitting there doing nothing, and that Wren was welcome to it for as long as she needed to get the cellar sorted. Wren almost said no out of reflex, the old instinct to refuse things before they could be taken back. But she was tired in a way that went past her bones, and she said yes instead. Ruth Ann turned out to be smaller than Gideon by half, and twice as sharp-tongued, a woman who ran the church's Wednesday food pantry and did not believe in wasted time or wasted food. She took one look at Wren's boots, still damp from the day's work, and set them by the wood stove without asking, then put a plate in front of her that was too full to finish, and didn't say a word about it when Wren couldn't. "Eat what you can," Ruth Ann said. "Rest is for tomorrow's you to worry about." Over dinner, Ruth Ann mentioned, in the easy way people mention things they don't think matter much, that her own mother used to clean house for old Elias Callaway back in the 70s, before he'd gone reclusive. Said he kept a journal going every single day of his life. Wrote in it after supper, same chair, same lamp, wouldn't be disturbed for love or money. She said it like a small, unremarkable fact. Wren filed it away like it was gold. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed under a quilt that smelled like cedar, Wren found herself thinking not about the crate, but about the smaller bundle beside it, the flat, oilcloth-wrapped shape that Gideon hadn't tried to move. A journal made sense. A journal would explain a lock that mattered more than the crate itself. Do you ever notice how the smaller mystery can end up mattering more than the big one? She was back at the barn by 7 the next morning, before Gideon had even finished his coffee, standing at the cellar door in her new boots with the pry bar in hand, like it might answer questions on its own. Gideon arrived 20 minutes later, with a socket wrench set and a can of penetrating oil, and together they worked the crate's rusted hinges for the better part of an hour, coaxing the metal loose fraction by fraction, rather than forcing it. Gideon insisting the whole time that patience now would save regret later. When the lid finally gave, it came up with a groan of swollen wood and a smell of old paper and something metallic underneath, and inside, wrapped in what had once been waxed cloth and had mostly held against the damp, were bundles of cash, bills so old in style that Wren didn't recognize half of them, banded together with brittle rubber that crumbled at a touch, stacked in neat rows like someone had taken real care in placing them there. Gideon went very quiet. The kind of quiet that told Wren he understood the size of what they were looking at better than she did in the moment. "That's not town money," he said finally. "That's not anybody's grocery money. That's put-away money. Somebody's whole life savings, maybe more than one life." Wren didn't reach for it right away. She sat back on her heels, water still seeping cold through the knees of her jeans, and looked instead at the second bundle, the oilcloth-wrapped shape that had been sitting beside the crate the whole time, patient and smaller, and somehow, to her, more urgent. "That one first," she said. Gideon didn't argue. He lifted it out with both hands, set it on a dry section of the stone shelf, and let her be the one to unwrap it. Inside the oilcloth was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked but intact, the pages inside foxed with age but legible, and folded into the front cover, in an envelope that had somehow stayed dry against all odds, was a letter, her name written across the front in a shaking, careful hand. For Wren, when she's the one who comes looking. She sat with that envelope in her hands for a long moment before she could make herself open it. Gideon, to his credit, found something to busy himself with near the door, giving her the room to have the moment without an audience. The letter was short, but every word of it landed like it had been chosen with care. "If you're the one reading this, then I was right to believe somebody would come looking eventually, even if it took longer than I'd have liked. I want you to understand something before you go any further into what's in this crate. The money was never the point. Money like this, hidden away and never spent, isn't worth a thing on its own. It's just paper, waiting for somebody to give it a purpose. What I'm really leaving you is the land, and the chance to build something on it that nobody can take back from you the way things got taken from this family once before. If you're patient, and if you're willing to work harder than seems fair, you'll understand what I mean by the time you're done. Don't let anybody tell you what you're worth. I never did, and it cost me plenty, but it's the one thing I got right." She read it twice. The second time, her eyes caught on the phrase, "taken from this family once before," and she thought of Gideon's father's half-remembered story about the bank, the county losing its savings overnight, the Callaways somehow spared. She thought, too, of Ruth Ann's mother and the journal Elias had kept every night without fail. Whatever the full story was, it hadn't finished revealing itself yet, and some old, wary part of her understood that the letter was a beginning, not an answer. "You all right?" Gideon asked, from a respectful distance. "I think so," Wren said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was mostly true. They spent the rest of the morning carefully cataloguing what the crate held, the bundles of cash, which Gideon insisted needed to go to the bank in town before anything else happened to them, and beneath the cash, wrapped separately, a set of yellowed legal documents that neither of them could quite make sense of on the spot, full of surveyor's language and old plat numbers that didn't match anything Wren recognized about the quarter-acre she'd been left. "This deed talk isn't matching up with what the will described," Gideon said, running a thickened finger down one of the pages, frowning at it, the way a man frowns at a puzzle he suspects is bigger than he first thought. "I think you ought to bring this to somebody who reads this kind of paper for a living." Wren folded the documents carefully back into their oilcloth, the journal and the letter set safely on top, and looked out through the barn's broken doorway at the grey hillside beyond it, the same hillside her family had laughed off as worthless not 2 days before. Whatever that paperwork meant, she had the distinct, steadying feeling that Dale was going to regret that joke a great deal more than he currently understood. The lawyer who'd read the will, Mr. Prather, was not an easy man to get an appointment with, but Ruth Ann knew his receptionist from church, and by Thursday afternoon, Wren was sitting across a cluttered desk from him with the strange legal documents spread out between them, feeling smaller in his office than she had at the will reading itself, if that was possible. Prather took his time with the papers, adjusting his glasses, running a finger along lines of surveyor's notation that meant nothing to Wren, but clearly meant something to him, because his eyebrows kept climbing higher as he read. Finally, he sat back, folded his hands and said, "Do you know what a boundary amendment is, Miss Calloway?" She didn't. Sometime back in the 50s, your great-grandfather filed one of these on the quarter-acre, the Cellar parcel. Amendments like this were common enough when land got subdivided sloppy, families selling off pieces here and there, except this one wasn't subdividing anything away, it was folding a piece back in. He tapped the page. According to this, the quarter-acre you were left isn't just the quarter-acre. There's a boundary line here that was never formally severed from the original tract. Near 11 acres of bottomland running along the creek. The same bottomland everybody assumed went to your Uncle Dale as part of the main property. Wren sat very still. Assumed, Prather repeated, something almost like amusement flickering behind his tired eyes, because nobody bothered to actually check the recorded plat before dividing things up at the reading. I'd wager your great-grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote that will the way he did. Left you the worthless piece, technically, while making sure the paperwork underneath it told a different story than the will read out loud. Have you ever had somebody prove they were smarter than everyone gave them credit for, a full lifetime after the fact? It would take weeks to sort through the county records and confirm the amendment held up, Prather warned her. Dale's lawyer, once word got out, was certain to contest it, and contest it hard, because 11 acres of good bottomland along a year-round creek was worth considerably more than a house and some tobacco fields. But the paperwork was old, properly filed, and properly witnessed, and Prather didn't think Dale had much of a leg to stand on beyond outrage. Outrage, as it turned out, was exactly what Dale had. He showed up at the barn 3 days later, uninvited, his truck kicking gravel as he pulled in too fast, and found Wren and Gideon in the middle of reinforcing one of the collapsed cellar shelves. Dale didn't bother with a greeting. "You think you're clever," he said, before he'd even gotten fully out of the truck, going behind everybody's back to some lawyer. "I went to the lawyer who read the will," Wren said, evenly, though her pulse was going hard against her ribs. "Same one you did. That land's not yours. Everybody at that reading heard what you got." "Everybody at that reading heard what the will said out loud," Gideon put in, quiet but immovable, wrench still in hand. "Don't recall anybody reading the recorded plat amendments that morning." Dale's face went a shade darker. He looked at Gideon like he was deciding whether the man had any right to be standing there at all, then looked back at Wren, and for a moment something flickered under the anger, something that looked almost like fear, though Wren couldn't have said fear of what. "Your great-grandfather was losing his mind those last years," he said. "Everybody knew it. You think a judge is going to side with some scrap of paper over a family's word?" "I think," Wren said, surprising herself with how steady it came out, "that you laughed about giving me a flooded hole in the ground, and now you're standing on my property telling me I don't deserve what's actually in the paperwork. Which is it, Dale? Was it worthless, or wasn't it?" He didn't have an answer for that. He got back in his truck, gravel spraying again on the way out, and Wren stood there afterward with her heart going too fast, half expecting to feel afraid, and finding, instead, something closer to grim satisfaction. That evening, back at Gideon and Ruth Ann's table, Wren finally opened the journal properly for the first time, not searching for anything specific, just reading, page by careful page, in Elias's small, slanted handwriting. Most entries were mundane, weather, chores, small complaints about his knees. But scattered through them, especially in entries from decades back, were references that snagged at her attention. A mention of the rural boy's father causing trouble again about the creek line, a note about moved the second bundle to the flat spot, better odds against the water there, and, in an entry dated some 50 years earlier, a single unsettling line, told nobody about the second parcel. Not even her. Some things are safer buried than spoken, not even her. Wren read the line 3 times, feeling the shape of a question take hold that she couldn't yet answer. Who was her? A wife? A daughter? Someone the family had lost track of, the same way they'd lost track of Wren herself. Ruth Ann, catching sight of her expression across the table, asked gently what she'd found, and Wren read the line aloud. Ruth Ann went quiet, in a way that made Wren look up sharply. "My mother used to say," Ruth Ann said slowly, like she was pulling the memory up from somewhere she hadn't visited in years, "that old Elias had a daughter who left this county before I was even born. Left angry, my mother said, over some falling out nobody ever explained. Far as I know, nobody in your family ever talks about her." "A daughter," Wren repeated. "Not my grandmother. Don't know," Ruth Ann admitted. "That's about all my mother ever said on it. People round here didn't gossip about the Callaways much, back then. Your great-grandfather wasn't a man who invited questions." Wren looked back down at the journal, at the small, careful handwriting that had kept a secret for 50 years, in a book nobody was supposed to find, and felt the quiet certainty that whatever answer waited at the bottom of all this, it was going to matter a great deal more than 11 acres of bottomland. The bank money, once Gideon convinced her it needed proper handling, turned into its own small ordeal. The regional bank in town wouldn't take old bundled cash without a conversation about its origin, and that conversation turned into 2 weeks of paperwork, a currency appraiser driving in from 2 counties over, and a great deal of Wren sitting in waiting rooms, trying not to fidget while men in ties decided how much of her own inheritance she was allowed to touch and when. In the end, the appraiser confirmed what Gideon had guessed from the start. It wasn't grocery money. Once converted and deposited, it was enough to rebuild the barn, repair the cellar properly, and still have a cushion left over that made Wren's hands shake a little the first time she saw the number written down. She didn't spend it carelessly. If anything, having it made her more careful, not less. Like she was afraid that spending it too fast would prove Dale right somehow, that she didn't know what to do with something good once she finally had it. Do you know that feeling where getting the thing you needed almost scares you more than not having it did? Gideon helped her draw up a plan for the property that made sense. Shore up the barn first, since a barn on solid ground was worth more than a cellar full of money sitting under a building that might collapse on it, then work outward from there. Word had gotten around town by then, the way it does in places small enough that everyone's business becomes everyone's business within a week, and Wren found herself the subject of a particular kind of attention she wasn't used to. Not quite respect yet, but no longer outright dismissal either. Patsy Rule predictably had opinions. She showed up at the mailbox again on a cold, bright Saturday, while Wren and Gideon were unloading lumber from his truck, arms crossed in her usual posture. "Heard you're rebuilding," she said. "Heard you got yourself a lawyer, too." My, I did," Wren said, and didn't offer more than that. "Elias never was right in the head those last years," Patsy said, echoing Dale almost word for word, though something in her tone had softened just slightly from outright mockery into something closer to nervous curiosity. "Strange old man. My husband always said he heard him talking to himself out here some evenings, like there was somebody with him." Wren set down the board she was carrying. "Talking to who?" Patsy shrugged, already looking like she regretted volunteering the detail. "Couldn't say. Ronnie always figured it was just an old man losing his grip. Course, Ronnie also figured that cellar wasn't worth the dirt around it, so maybe don't put too much stock in what Ronnie figured." She said it almost like an apology, then turned and walked back up her own drive before Wren could ask anything further. Wren filed the detail away next to the journal's unsettling line, "Not even her," and the mention of a daughter who'd left the county angry, decades ago, for reasons nobody would name. That evening, she went back through the journal with new purpose, hunting specifically for anything from the years Ruth Ann's mother had mentioned, and found, tucked between entries about roof repairs and church suppers, a scattering of lines that read differently once she knew what she was looking for. Margaret wrote again. Told her the same as always. Not yet. And a few pages later, in a hand that looked shakier, like it had been written under some strain, Margaret says she won't ask again. Maybe that's for the best. Some doors, once shut, oughtn't be forced back open, not even by the one who shut them. Margaret. A name, finally, where before there had only been her. She brought the name to Ruth Ann first, over dinner, half expecting another vague, second-hand memory. But this time, Ruth Ann went very still, fork halfway to her mouth. Margaret Calloway, she said slowly. My mother did used to say that name. Elias's daughter. I hadn't thought of it in years, but that's it. Margaret, do you know what happened to her? Why she left? No idea, hun. My mother always went quiet whenever it came up, like it wasn't her business to speculate. Small towns. Some stories just get left alone. Gideon, listening from the other end of the table, set his own fork down thoughtfully. You said the journal mentioned a bank thing, the county losing money back in the 30s. Margaret would have been young then, if she's Elias's daughter. Maybe a child, maybe not born yet, depending on the years. Might be nothing to do with each other, might be everything. Wren didn't sleep well that night, turning the name over and over. Margaret, who'd written letters that got the same answer every time, not yet, until finally she stopped asking at all. She thought about the second, smaller bundle in the cellar, and wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, whether there was anything else down there she and Gideon hadn't found yet. Something that might explain why a father would keep his own daughter waiting for an answer he apparently never gave her. The next morning, back at the cellar, now mostly drained and shored up with new support beams Gideon had installed the week before, Wren found herself looking not at the walls or the shelves this time, but at the floor itself. The old stone flagging, uneven in places, one corner near the back sitting slightly higher than the rest, like it had been disturbed once and never quite settled back into place. She knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the raised stone. It gave, just slightly, under the pressure. Not much, but enough to notice, enough to make the back of her neck prickle with the particular, familiar feeling of a story that wasn't finished revealing itself. "Gideon," she called, and heard the change in her own voice even as she said it. "I think there's something under this." It took the better part of the morning to work the flagstone loose, Gideon insisting on going slow, testing the surrounding stones first to make sure lifting one wouldn't bring a section of the floor down around them. When it finally came free, it revealed a shallow cavity beneath, lined with the same waxed cloth as the crate above, and inside it, dry and untouched by all those years of flooding, was a second, smaller journal, newer than the first, the leather less worn, the handwriting inside less steady, clearly written later in Elias's life. Wren didn't open it right away. She sat back on her heels in the cool cellar air, the small book heavy in her hands, and felt the particular hesitation of someone about to learn something they weren't sure they wanted to know. "Might not be my business to say," Gideon offered, watching her, "but whatever's in there was hidden twice. Once in the crate, and then again, separate, under the floor. Man went to some trouble to keep the two apart." "Two answers," Wren murmured. "Or one answer he wasn't ready to give until he knew somebody would actually go looking for it." She read it that night, alone in the spare room, the first journal set aside for the moment, this newer one open across her knees. Much of it covered the same ground as before: weather, small complaints, the slow business of an old man's days. But woven through it, in entries clearly written after whatever had happened with Margaret, was a different kind of confession. "I told myself I was protecting her by saying, 'Not yet.' Truth is, I didn't know how to say yes without admitting what the money cost this family in the first place. Some debts don't show up on any ledger. And further in, an entry that made Wren's breath catch. If Margaret's line doesn't come back to claim what's here, then whoever does come, however far removed, however forgotten by the rest of this family, deserves to know the whole of it, not just the money. The land was never mine to hoard. It was meant to be a foundation for somebody who'd actually have to build something from nothing. Same as I once did. Same as I once did. Wren read that phrase 3 times, feeling the shape of an earlier hint click into place. Gideon's father's half-remembered story about the county losing its savings during the bank collapse. The Callaways somehow spared. She turned back to the first journal, hunting for the entry Gideon had mentioned weeks ago, and found it again with new eyes. Moved the second bundle to the flat spot. Better odds against the water there, not just a description of hiding money. A man who had once nearly lost everything himself, choosing, deliberately, to hide a second chance for whoever might need it after him. She was still turning that over 3 days later, in the middle of finally clearing the last of the collapsed shelving from the cellar's east wall, when the setback came without any warning at all. Gideon had gone to town for lumber, and Wren, impatient and wanting to feel useful, decided to start clearing debris from a section of shelving near the ceiling on her own. Nothing Gideon hadn't already deemed structurally sound, but a section they hadn't fully tested with weight on it. She was 3 rungs up a borrowed ladder, reaching for a splintered board, when the shelf support gave way beneath her hand, and the whole section came down at once. Not onto her directly, but close enough that she threw herself sideways off the ladder to avoid it, landing hard against the stone flagging, pain shooting bright and sudden up through her left ankle. She lay there a moment, breath knocked half out of her, the cellar dust settling slow through the beam of the worklight, and felt something close to panic for the first time since the will reading. Not because of the pain, though it was considerable, but because of how alone she suddenly felt. Out on that hillside, with no one close enough to hear her if she called. It took nearly 20 minutes, dragging herself along the wall, gritting through the pain, before she made it up the cellar steps and out into the grey afternoon light, and another hour of sitting on the cold ground before Gideon's truck finally came rattling up the drive. The ankle wasn't broken, the doctor in town confirmed the next morning, but it was badly sprained, and she was told, in no uncertain terms, to stay off it for at least 2 weeks, an instruction that felt, to Wren, almost crueler than the injury itself. 2 weeks of sitting still, watching the rebuild stall, watching winter creep a little closer, with the barn still half repaired. Have you ever gotten so close to building something real, only to have your own body remind you how fast it can all stop? Ruth Ann, without being asked, moved a chair and a stack of quilts down by the wood stove and more or less installed Wren there for the duration, bringing her meals and refusing, gently but firmly, any argument about getting up too soon. Gideon kept working the property alone in the mornings, reporting back each evening on what he'd managed, and Wren found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, forced to sit with her own thoughts instead of outrunning them with work. It was during that stretch of enforced stillness, flipping back through both journals side by side, that she noticed something she'd missed before. A name mentioned only once in the first journal, in an entry from decades back, almost in passing. Talked to young Gideon Marsh's father about the roof again. Good, quiet man. Doesn't ask more than he needs to know. She looked up from the page, toward the kitchen where Gideon was quietly repairing a hinge on Ruth Ann's cabinet, and felt something shift into place. Not a mystery exactly, but a small, warm recognition that the men who'd shown up to help her hadn't come from nowhere. Their kindness had roots too, older than she'd realized, reaching all the way back to a quiet old man who'd noticed, decades ago, who in this town could be trusted. She still didn't know what had truly happened with Margaret, or why the money had waited so long, under 2 separate locks, for someone to come claim it properly. But sitting there with her ankle propped up and both journals open across her lap, she understood, for the first time, that this story had been building toward her long before she ever knew to look for it. The 2 weeks off her ankle stretched into 3, the doctor unimpressed with how much weight she'd tried to put on it too soon. And by the time Wren was properly back on her feet, the first hard frost of the season had settled over Harlow's Bend, silvering the kudzu vines and turning the mud around the cellar door stiff and brittle underfoot. Gideon had kept the barn work moving in her absence, but the season was turning against them now, and there was a new urgency to the work that hadn't been there before. Get the roof sealed before the real cold came, or lose months waiting out the winter with everything half finished. It was Carol Jean, of all people, who brought the next piece of the puzzle, stopping by one afternoon with a box of week-old muffins from the diner and a look on her face like she wasn't sure whether what she'd learned was good news or bad. "My aunt does genealogy," she said, setting the box down on Ruth Ann's table. "For fun, mostly. Church newsletter kind of stuff. I mentioned your great-grandfather's name to her, just making conversation, and she about dropped her coffee. Why?" said the name Margaret Calloway turned up years back in some old county newspaper archive she was digging through. Margaret Calloway Whitfield, by the time she was mentioned, married name. Lived 2 counties over, up until she passed some years back. My aunt says she's got grandchildren still living, if the records are right. A whole branch of family nobody around here ever talks about. Wren sat with that a long moment, feeling the shape of the story widen in a direction she hadn't expected. Not just an old man's guilt over a daughter he'd shut out, but an entire living family, somewhere, who might have no idea any of this existed. The cellar, the money, the letter addressed to whoever came looking. Do you ever find out a story you thought was almost finished was actually only half told? She brought it to Prather the following week, ankles still stiff but manageable, and watched him go very quiet and thoughtful over the documents spread across his desk. "Legally," he said carefully, "the will as written names you, specifically, as the one who inherits the cellar parcel and everything found within it. Margaret's descendants have no claim unless you choose to extend one. That said," he paused, choosing his words the way lawyers do when they're stepping outside the strictly legal into something more human. "Your great-grandfather's own journal, in his own words, seems to suggest he felt real guilt about how he handled that relationship. That's not a legal fact, but it might be worth something to you all the same." Wren didn't answer right away. She thought about the letter in the crate, "Don't let anybody tell you what you're worth," and about a woman named Margaret, who had, by every account she'd found so far, spent decades being told exactly that by her own father's silence. She decided, without much debate in her own mind, that she would write to Margaret's family once the dust settled, not to give away what had been legally left to her, but to make sure they knew the truth of what their grandmother had been shut out of, and why. It felt like the kind of thing Elias himself, judging by his own late remorse, would have wanted done. That resolved, or at least set aside for later, the work on the barn picked back up in earnest, and it was there, 3 days after her visit to Prather's office, that the real crisis of the rebuild arrived. A storm rolled through faster than the forecast had promised, dropping the temperature hard and fast, and bringing with it a wind that came screaming down off the ridge just as Gideon and Wren were finishing the last of the new roof supports. They heard the crack before they saw it. One of the old original beams, weakened by decades of rot they hadn't caught in time, giving way under the sudden weight of wind-driven debris, and the whole northeast corner of the barn's frame came down in a groan of splintering wood, taking a section of the new work with it. Nobody was hurt. By some grace, neither of them examined too closely afterward, but the damage was significant enough that Gideon, standing in the wreckage the next morning with his cap pulled low against the cold, looked genuinely shaken for the first time since Wren had known him. "This sets us back weeks," he said. Maybe worse, if we don't get lumber before the roads ice up. Wren stood looking at the collapsed corner, at the wasted labor of the past month, scattered across the frozen ground, and felt something close to despair reach up and take hold of her. Not just about the barn, but about all of it. The money, and the letters, and the guilt, and the family 2 counties over, who didn't yet know they existed to her. For the first time since the will reading, she let herself wonder, quietly, whether she'd been foolish to believe any of this would end differently than everything else in her life had. "I don't know if I can fix this fast enough," she admitted, and hearing herself say it out loud made it feel more true than she wanted it to be. Gideon didn't offer easy comfort. He crouched down instead, picked up a fallen beam, turned it over in his hands, studying the break in the wood, like it might tell him something useful. "Your great-grandfather lost near everything once," he said finally. "Whole county did, back in his day. He didn't get to where he ended up by things going easy the first time, or the second. Way I see it, you're not behind schedule. You're just at the part of the story where it gets hard before it gets good." Wren looked at him, and then back at the collapsed corner of the barn, snow beginning to spit thin and sideways out of a sky gone the color of old iron, and understood that whatever came next, she was going to have to decide, once and for all, whether she believed that too. The lumber took 9 days to arrive, the roads icing over twice in that stretch, and shutting down deliveries entirely for the better part of a week. And Wren spent most of that time in a state she didn't have a good name for. Not quite despair, but close to it. A low, persistent ache of doubt that sat with her through every quiet hour. She kept the journals close during those days, rereading Elias's later entries until the pages had gone soft at the corners, searching for something in his words that might tell her how a man came back from losing everything once, let alone twice. She found it, eventually, not in a single dramatic passage, but in a scattering of small ones across different years, each one adding a little more weight to the picture. Lost the tobacco crop again this year. Hard not to feel it's a sign I ought to quit trying. Didn't quit. And later, bank took what it took. What it couldn't take was knowing how to start over with less than I started with the first time. And later still, in the same shaking hand as the entries about Margaret, "The land forgives you for trying and failing. It's the only thing I ever found that does. Do you know what it's like to find, in somebody else's old, private words, the exact thing you needed to hear and didn't know to ask for?" The lumber finally came on a grey Tuesday, and with it, unexpectedly, came help she hadn't asked for. Word had spread through Harlow's Bend about the storm damage the way word spread about everything in a town that size. And on the morning the trucks were finally able to make it up Route 9, Wren found not just Gideon waiting at the barn, but 3 other men from town she barely knew. One of them, to her genuine surprise, Ronnie Rule, Patsy's husband. The same man who'd once told anyone who'd listen that the cellar wasn't worth the dirt around it. "Patsy sent me," Ronnie said gruffly, not quite meeting her eye, hauling a length of lumber off the truck bed without being asked. "Said it'd be a poor kind of neighbor who let a girl rebuild a barn alone in this weather over some old grudge that was never really hers to hold in the first place." He paused, adjusting his grip on the wood. "For what it's worth, I was wrong about the cellar. Didn't figure I'd say that out loud, but there it is." Wren didn't trust herself to answer that right away, so she just nodded and let the work speak for whatever she couldn't yet say. They rebuilt the collapsed corner in 4 days flat, working through cold that numbed fingers and cracked knuckles, Gideon directing the effort with the quiet authority of a man who'd clearly been trusted to lead jobs before. And by the end of the 4th day, the northeast corner stood not just repaired, but stronger than the original had ever been. New beams set deeper, better braced against the kind of wind that had brought the old ones down. Standing in the barn's doorway that evening, watching the last of the men load their tools back into their trucks, Wren felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, distantly, as the opposite of the despair she'd been carrying all week. It was that same evening, going through the second journal one more time before bed, that she found the entry she'd somehow overlooked in all her earlier reading, tucked near the very back, dated only a handful of months before Elias's death, in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. If it's a Calloway who finds this, blood or otherwise, I want them to understand the real thing I learned too late. It was never really about being clever enough to hide money well. It was about being patient enough to trust that somebody, someday, would be stubborn enough to keep going even after everything fell apart around them. That's the only inheritance worth passing down. Everything else is just paper. She read it 3 times, and on the third read, she understood, with a clarity that settled deep and quiet in her chest, exactly why he'd hidden the second journal separately from the first, buried even deeper than the crate itself. The crate held what could be spent. This last, shaking confession held the only part of the inheritance that couldn't be taken away, contested by a cousin, or lost to a bank, or laughed off at a will reading by people who'd never once had to build anything from nothing. She thought of Margaret, decades ago, asking for an answer that never came. She thought of her own mother, gone too soon to ever explain the family she'd walked away from. And she thought, finally, of herself, sitting in that folding chair 3 months ago, $41 in her pocket, believing, for just a moment, that Dale might have been right about what she was worth. He hadn't been. She understood that now in a way she hadn't quite let herself believe before, not fully, not until the barn stood rebuilt, and stronger for having fallen once. She closed the journal gently, set it beside its older twin, and looked out the frost-rimed window toward the dark shape of the barn on the hillside, standing solid against a clearing winter sky. The legal contest from Dale came to a head in the second week of January, in a small hearing room that smelled of radiator heat and old carpet, and Wren walked in without Gideon or Ruth Ann beside her, not because they hadn't offered, but because she'd decided, quietly and on her own, that this was a moment she needed to stand through herself. Prather sat beside her at the table, calm as ever, the recorded plat amendment and Elias's original filings spread neatly in front of him. Dale's lawyer made his case with more confidence than substance, arguing that an old man's mental state in his final years cast doubt on any document filed under his authority, that the family's understanding at the will reading ought to carry as much weight as a decades-old amendment nobody remembered. Wren watched Dale while his lawyer talked, and saw, for the first time, something other than contempt on his face. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had built his sense of fairness on an assumption he'd never once checked, and was only now realizing how flimsy that foundation had been. When it was her turn, Wren didn't raise her voice, didn't perform outrage the way Dale had at the barn. She simply laid out what she'd found. The properly filed amendment, witnessed and recorded years before Elias's decline began. The journal entries showing a man of clear and deliberate mind, planning carefully for someone who might come looking long after he was gone. He didn't hide this because he was losing his grip, she said. He hid it because he wanted to see if anybody in this family would still care enough to look past what was easy to assume. The judge ruled within the week. The amendment held. Do you know what it feels like to finally win something, not by being clever, but simply by being right, and patient enough to prove it? Dale didn't attend the ruling in person, but he came to the barn once more, a few days later, alone this time, without the truck tires spraying gravel, without the anger from before. He stood at the edge of the property for a long moment before he said anything, looking at the rebuilt corner of the barn, at the cellar door standing open and dry behind it. I was wrong about the land, he said finally, the words clearly costing him something. Don't know that I was wrong about much else. You laughed at the reading, Wren said. Not cruelly, just true. I did. He didn't try to explain it away. Didn't figure you'd amount to needing an apology from me. Figured wrong about that too. He didn't stay long after that, didn't ask for anything, didn't offer much more. But it was, Wren understood, as close to making things right as Dale was likely ever going to get, and she found, to her own surprise, that she didn't need more than that from him. She let him go without either of them pretending at more warmth than actually existed between them. The letter to Margaret's family took her longer to write than the legal filings ever had. She went through 4 drafts before she found words that felt honest rather than performative, finally settling on something simple, an account of what she'd found, the journal entries about Margaret, Elias's late, aching regret, and an invitation, not an obligation, she made sure to say, but an open door, for Margaret's descendants to know the truth of what their grandmother had been shut out of, and to visit the land if they ever wanted to. The reply came 6 weeks later from a woman named Denise Whitfield, Margaret's granddaughter, who wrote that her own mother had passed down only fragments of the story, a vague sense of a father who'd never explained himself, a childhood spent wondering what she'd done wrong to deserve his silence. Denise wrote that reading Elias's late confession, even second-hand through Wren's letter, had answered a question her family had carried for 3 generations without ever expecting an answer. She asked, gently, if she might visit in the spring to see the place her grandmother had once been kept from. Wren wrote back the same day, yes. By late February, the barn stood fully repaired, its new corner stronger than any other section of the frame, and the cellar itself had been transformed almost past recognition. The flagstone floor reset and sealed against future flooding, proper drainage cut into the hillside above it, the space now serving as secure, dry storage rather than the flooded ruin it had been the day Wren first pried its door open. She'd used a portion of the money, carefully and without extravagance, to put a small, sturdy cabin on the cleared section of the newly confirmed bottomland. Nothing grand, but solid, built to last, with a wood stove and a porch that faced the creek. Gideon and Ruth Ann came by often enough that it stopped feeling like visiting and started feeling like something closer to family, and Carol Jean still brought week-old muffins on Sundays, though Wren noticed she'd started bringing fresh ones instead, like the gesture itself no longer needed the excuse of charity behind it. One evening in early March, sitting on the new porch with both journals open on her lap, a fire going warm behind her in the cabin's stove, Wren found herself writing in a fresh notebook of her own, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it felt, suddenly, like the kind of thing a Calloway did. She wrote about the will reading, about Dale's whispered line, about the flooded cellar and the crate and the second journal buried deeper still. She wrote about Margaret and about Denise's letter and about the particular, hard-won steadiness she felt now, sitting on land that was fully, undeniably hers. She thought of Elias's words, the ones that had stayed with her longest. That's the only inheritance worth passing down. Everything else is just paper. She understood, finally, exactly what he'd meant.